hear me? Okay, great. So, as I said earlier on, my name is Samuel. I'm a project consultant at Vortex Fire Consulting Inc. And for today's session, for this afternoon session, we're going to be looking at means of egress and then fire protection. Basically, we're going to look at how do we design our building to ensure safe evacuation of occupants in case of a fire, and also some of the fire protection requirements in Part 9 of the National Building Code of Canada. I have a comment here that there is a lot of disturbance. I hope you can hear me clear and loud.
He actually looks at the comments, which is nice.
So we will be covering section 9.9 of the National Building Code of Canada, and this section mainly discusses the applicable requirements for means of egress, or the requirements that are put in place to ensure that occupants can safely evacuate a building in the event of a fire. So to better understand the requirements under section 9.9 of the code, we want to first of all familiarize ourselves with some definitions in the code. So we will look at the terms such as means of egress, access to exit, and then exit. So these are three defined terms in the code, and they tend to be confusing sometimes. So what is a means of egress? So a means of egress is essentially providing a continuous path of travel, in a floor area in a building, and it essentially comprises the access to exit and then also the exit. So the exit and then the access to exit are part of our means of egress from a building. Okay. So your access to exit is essentially providing access to an exit in a floor area. So if you look at this small sketch that I have on the side here, this is your access to exit, which is essentially the clear path of travel in this floor area, and then your exit is the part of the means of egress that provides that enables you to exit or get out of the building in the event of a fire. Okay. So this would typically be your exit, as you can see over there in the blue highlight, and then your access to the exit will typically be the clear path of travel from the floor area, as well as the doors that connect the rooms within the floor area, and these two constitute the means of egress from a building. Now, section 992 discusses the types and purposes of an exit. So what is an exit, or what can constitute an exit? So an exit, or a means of egress or an access to exit, can include an exterior doorway providing access from the floor area or from within the building to the outside. We can also have an exterior passageway. You can have an exterior ramp. You can have an exterior stairway. A fire escape may be permitted. You can also have a horizontal exit, which will enable you to exit from one building to the other. You can also have an interior passageway, an interior ramp, and then an interior stairway. So these are the different exits that you can have from a floor area. So still under 992, so an exit must be designed for no purpose other than for exiting. So if you have an exit from your floor area, for instance, an exit stair, it cannot serve any other purpose other than, providing a safe means of evacuating a building in the event of a fire, except that your exit may serve as an access to a floor area. One other requirement is that elevators, slide escapes, and then windows shall also not be considered as part of a required means of egress. So the code basically does not consider elevators and then slide escapes and then windows. There are some exemptions though for windows, typically for dwelling units where you can have you basically required to provide windows or doors from bedrooms to enable occupants to escape. Still under types and purposes of exit, so at least one door at every principal entrance to a building that provide access from the exterior at ground level must be designed in accordance with the requirements for exit. So this is typically applicable to where you have a shared egress or where you have multiple suites in a building. Okay, so you have to design at least the principal entrance to the building to meet the requirements for an exit. And of course, this will not be applicable to doors that serve a single dwelling unit, a house or a dwelling unit with a secondary suite. So under section 993, we are looking at dimensions of means of egress. I know in today's first session you had a look at some of the requirements for exits and then for stairs, for instance, within a dwelling unit or within a floor area. So under this section, most of the requirements that we will be looking at are not applicable to exits that serve dwelling unit or a dwelling unit with a secondary suite, and are also not applicable to access to exits within dwelling units. So this is mainly this for exiting within dwelling units. We will look at the requirements for egress from dwelling units in a later section of in a later section of this slide, and then most of them were also discussed in the earlier session with my colleague Sarah. So dimensions of a means of egress. So the width of every exit facility in a building designed to Part 9 must be at least 900 millimeters. As I stated earlier on, this will not be applicable to exits within dwelling unit. Depending on what you're looking at, for dwelling units, you may be required to have either a 900 millimeter wide exit or 860 millimeter wide exit. Now, where you have a public corridor serving floor areas in a building designed to Part 9 of the code, it is required to be at least 1100 millimeter wide. The minimum clear height in exit and then access to exit is also required to be 2.1 meters or not less than 2.1 meters. And the where you have a storage garage, it must be at least 2 meters high. And again, this is all discussed in section 993 of the code. So just an illustration over here. So this is, for instance, a floor area containing multiple dwelling units where you have a public corridor, connecting or providing the access to exit from these dwelling units. So for instance, the stairs or the exit stair will be required to be not less than 900 millimeters wide, and then your corridor portion of the exit would be required to be not less than 1100 millimeter wide. And then on top of that, you have these access to exits being connected to an exterior exit doorway that enable occupants to safely evacuate the floor area in the event of a fire. fire protection of exits. So an exit is, as a matter of fact, the safest place within a building. So if there is a fire, within a building, right, the exit has to be the safest portion in the building. So exits are typically required to be fire separated from the remainder of the building by a fire separation with a fire resistance rating. And the fire resistance rating is required to be not less than 45 minutes. But if you have, for instance, a building that for which the floor assembly is required to be 1 hour rated, the fire resistance rating of the exits would have to match the fire resistance rating of the floor assembly that it serves. So if the floor assemblies in the building are, for instance, for some reason not required to be fire resistance rated, then the exit fire separation is required to be 45-minute rated. If the floor assembly is required to be 1 hour rated, then the exit fire separation will match the fire resistance rating of the floor assembly. Still under 994, a fire separation, because an exit is the safest area within a building. We design it to be smoke tight. We want to ensure that the exit does not contribute to the spread of fire from one floor area to another floor area, for instance. And we also want to restrict the spread of fire from the floor area into the exit. And for that matter, the fire separation common to two exits must be smoke tight and not be pierced by doorways, ductwork, piping, or any other opening that may affect the continuity of the fire separation. Of course, you can have a doorway that provides access from the exit to the other portions of the floor area. But even for that, the doorway will have to have a certain form of fire protection in order to maintain the integrity of the exit. A fire separation that separates an exit from the remainder of the building must also have no openings except for services that serve the exit. So for instance, if you have mechanical or ductwork in the building, these ductwork cannot penetrate the fire separation for the exit unless these penetrations are actually serving just the exit. Okay, so the code has some exemptions for openings that may be permitted. So you can have openings for standpipe systems, you can have openings for sprinkler piping, you can also have opening for exit doorways, as I said earlier on. And there are also some provisions to have, for instance, wired glass and then glass blocks within the exit there. So where you have for instance, wired glass or glazing in the exit fire separation, remember we mentioned that an exit has to be fire separated from the remainder of the building. So if you want to have glazing, the combined area of glazing indoors and side lights in the exit fire separation should not exceed 0.8 meters squared, except where an exit enclosure connects with a floor area through an enclosed vestibule or corridor. So for instance, if you look at the sketch that we have on the right side, so if you want to have glazing in the exit fire separation, okay, the area of that glazing will not be more than 0.8 square meters. Unless, however, if you have, for instance, a vestibule or a corridor that connects the floor area to the exit, then you can have unlimited unlimited glazing in that vestibule, provided that the corridor is constructed as a fire separation with a fire resistance rating not less than 45 minutes. So and that waiver is essentially because you have some form of a common area before you get into the exit fire separation. So still under section 994 fire protection of exits, we are going to look at where you have unprotected openings near an exterior stairway or an unenclosed exterior exit stair and ramp. This is covered in section 9944 in article 9944 of the code, and then 9945. So from 9944 to 9946, the code discusses openings near unenclosed exit stairs, as well as openings in exterior walls of exit, and then openings in exterior walls of other fire compartments that may pose exposure issues to occupants using the exit. So we will first of all start off by looking at the unprotected openings near unenclosed exterior exit stairs and ramp. So when you have an unenclosed exterior exit stair or ramp that is providing the only means of egress from a suite, and where, for instance, as you can see in the sketch, that exterior exit stair may be exposed to fire from other areas in the building as a result of an opening that you have on there, you are required to protect that opening if it is located within 3 meters horizontally of the exterior exit stair, and also less than 10 meters below the exit stair or ramp. So if you have an opening that is such that it is less than 3 meters measured horizontally to the exterior exit stair, or the opening is less than 10 meters below an exit stair, then you have to protect that opening. And the protection that you will be looking at is, either a closure or, wired glass or wired glass assembly or glass block. Okay. And this is essentially to, the exit is the safest portion of the building. So we don't want a situation whereby occupants are using the exit and then they may be exposed to radiant heat coming from a fire in other areas in the building. Now, how about when you have a scenario whereby you have an exit enclosure, and then you have openings in the exit enclosure, and then also an adjacent exterior wall. So the code requires protection of openings in exterior walls of a building that intersect at an angle less than 135 degrees, and where the openings in the exterior wall of the building may lead to exposure issues within the exit fire separation. So for instance, in this sketch that we have over here, we have 2 dwelling units being served by an exit enclosure over here. There is an opening in the exit stair enclosure, the exit enclosure. There is also an opening in the exterior wall of the dwelling unit. Now, if there is a fire in the dwelling unit, there is the potential for the radiant heat from that dwelling unit to reach the occupants using the exit enclosure through the opening that we have in the exit. So where you have the exterior wall of a building and then the exit intersecting at an angle less than 135 degrees, and there are openings in these 2 exterior walls such that occupants using the exit may be exposed, you are also required to protect either of the opening. Of course, if you protect the opening in the exit enclosure, then it will limit radiant heat from reaching occupants using the exit. If you protect the opening in the dwelling unit, in the exterior wall of the dwelling unit, then that will also prevent or reduce any radiant heat that may reach occupants through the opening in the exit enclosure. Okay, and then again, this is to prevent fire spread through the exterior wall of the building to the exit enclosure. Article 9946 also discusses openings near exit doors. So this is also very similar to the 2 scenarios that we discussed, that we just discussed. In this scenario, you have, for instance, a dwelling unit with an exterior window and also an exterior door. Okay, and then you also have another dwelling unit, and it's such that there is an opening on the exterior wall of that dwelling unit, okay, on the far right side. And then there is also an exterior exit door. So these dwelling units have their own independent exiting, but we don't want the situation whereby an occupant using his, exiting from his unit is exposed to fire from the adjacent compartment. Okay, so if you have an exterior door in one fire compartment and it's within 3 meters horizontally of an opening in another fire compartment, then you have to protect one of the openings. Okay, so the protection can either be a closure or a door with a fire protection rating, or you can have wired glass or glass block in the window to prevent exposure issues. So still on the fire protection of exits, the code has some waivers for, stairways that serve the second story of a Group D or Group E suite. Okay, so if you have, for instance, let's say you have a 2-story office building, right? What we're saying here is that the exits in this serving this suite is permitted to be not constructed as exits there. And what we mean by not constructed as exits there is that it may be an open stair. You need not construct it as a fire separation with a fire resistance rating, provided certain criteria are satisfied. And the criteria is that the building height would have to be not more than 2 stories. The maximum area of the suite, remember we're talking about suite here and not the floor area or the building area. The maximum area of the suite would have to be not more than 100 square meters, and the travel distance to the exterior would have to be not more than 25 meters. And this travel distance is actually, for instance, if you have a 2-story suite, it's measured from the second story to the exterior doorway. Okay, and on top of that, a 45-minute fire resistance rating is provided between the suite and then adjacent suites or the basement. Okay, so if you have multiple suites, okay, then you have to provide a fire separation with a fire resistance rating of 45 minutes between the suites in order to apply this waiver for constructing the exit as a fire separation with a fire resistance rating. Again, this is in Article 9947 of the code under stairways in 2 stories, and it's only applicable to Group D or E buildings. So we will move on to obstructions and hazards in means of egress. Our means of egress is supposed to provide a continuous path of travel from the building to a safe area outside the building. Okay, so we don't want a situation whereby we have obstructions or any object or hazards that may impede or restrict occupants' access to exits. Okay, so if you have a corridor or if you have an occupancy in a corridor, the occupancy in the corridor is required to not reduce the required width of the corridor to less than required. And if you remember, we discussed that typically corridors are required to be not less than 1100 millimeter wide. So if you have an occupancy in a public corridor, it is required to not reduce the width of the corridor. Also, obstructions located within 1980 millimeters of the floor must not project horizontally more than 100 millimeters into exit passageways and corridors. And the other requirement is that no fixture, turnstile, or construction may project into the required width of an exit. So if for instance, you have any fixture or turnstile or any construction in the public corridor or the exit, the most important thing is that you still maintain that required width of the exit to enable occupants to safely evacuate the building. Obstructions and hazards in means of egress is discussed in 995 of the code, and Article 9955 of the code, obstructions in means of egress. Now, if you have an obstruction such as a post or turnstile, you may be allowed to, reduce the width of the exit or path of travel. So no obstructions such as post or turnstiles may restrict the width of a means of egress to less than 750 millimeters, unless there is an alternate unobstructed means of egress that is provided and which is plainly visible from the restricted egress. Okay, so this is also discussed under 9955 of the code. There are also some restrictions on, the for instance, the items that you can have in an exit. So the first thing is that no mirror may be placed, adjacent to any exit. You can also not have any draperies or, again, mirrors near the exit, and you can also not install a full or fired appliance in an exit or a corridor serving as an access to exit, because a full or fired appliance can be a source of a fire within a building, and the exit is required to be the safest portion in the building. Also, service rooms containing equipment that is subject to possible explosion must also not be located under required exit, as they have the potential to disrupt the integrity of the exit. So we will move on to subsection 996 of the code, doors in a means of egress. Okay, so obviously your door will be providing access from, for instance, a floor area to an exit stair. So what are the requirements for doors that are in a means of egress and that provide access to an exit? So when fully open, doors must not decrease the required width of an exit by more than 100 millimeters in exit corridors. Okay, so if an exit corridor or a public corridor, an exit corridor is required to be 1100 millimeters wide, and you have a door swinging into the exit, it must not decrease the required exit width by more than 100 millimeters. And where you have the exit, where you have the door opening into an exit, it must not reduce the exit width by 50 millimeters. Okay. Now, the swing of doors shall not reduce the width of the path of travel to less than 750 millimeters on exit stairs and the required width in exit corridor and passageway. So I have a sketch on the left side. Okay, so if you look at the door swing, it is not to reduce the width of the exit stair to less than 750 millimeters. And then for an exit corridor or a public corridor, you have to maintain the required width of the corridor, which is 1100 millimeters wide. Now, the clear opening height of a door that is providing a means of egress is required to be at least 20-30 millimeters. And where you have a door closer, typically when you have a door in a fire separation, you are typically required to have the doors on closers. That will return the door back to the closed position to maintain the integrity of the fire separation. So the clear opening height under door closers and other devices in the doorways must also be at least 1980 millimeters. This is discussed under subsection 9962 of the code. Doorways must be not less than 800 millimeter wide where there is only one door leaf, and in a multiple leaf door, the active leaf is required to be not less than 810 millimeters wide. Okay. Access and egress doors are required to swing on a vertical axis. And on top of that, exit doors are required to typically swing in the direction of exit travel, except where you have doors that, except where the occupant load being served is not more than 60 persons. We shall get to that. But when you have an exit door that serves providing access from a room or a suite that has an occupant load more than 60 persons, the exit door or the door providing the means of egress, which is the egress door, is required to swing in the direction of exit travel. Now, when you have paired doors, for instance, if you have a door in a corridor that has exit stairways on both ends of the corridor, right? You have to design, or the paired door swing has to be such that, you can swing in either direction to get to either of the exits on the opposite ends of the corridor. And for that reason, paired doors installed in the corridor must swing in opposite directions, with a door on the right-hand side swinging in the direction of exit travel. Okay, so typically, where you have a door, when you have, for instance, a floor area that contains multiple suites, okay, and your access to exit from these floor areas is through a public corridor, you have to locate exits on a minimum of 2 exits on both ends of the corridor, at opposite ends of the corridor. So if you have a door in the corridor, there has to be a means of ensuring that occupants can easily get to either exit. And how you do that is, if you have a paired door, you swing the doors in opposite directions, with a door on the right hand side swinging in the direction of exit travel. Now remember, we talked about the where you have a door swinging into an exit, you still need to maintain at least 750 millimeter clearance. There is also a requirement on the distance between the leading edge of the door and then the riser, and that distance is required to be not less than 300 millimeters. Again, this is to ensure that occupants are able to safely use the access to exit or the exits there serving the building. This is discussed in section 996 of the code. And it's under 9966 of the code, nearness of doors to stairs. Doors in proximity to stairs. So an exit door may open onto one step. So typically, an exit is required not to open onto a step. Okay. But you may be allowed to open an exit door onto one step if there is a danger of blockage from ice or snow. Right? Now, to do that, you have to ensure that the riser of the step that the door is opening onto is not more than 150 millimeters. And this is a clear illustration on that requirement. Now, under door latching, locking, and opening mechanism. Door latching, locking, and opening mechanisms is discussed in Article 9967 of the code. Okay, so we have to design or the door has to facilitate use of the exit stair. Okay, now to Ensure that occupants are able to safely evacuate the building. The doors providing access to an exit is required to be readily openable in the event of an emergency situation. Okay, so they have to be openable from the inside without requiring keys or special devices or specialized knowledge of the door opening mechanism. Okay, and they also have to be such that they do not automatically lock, after, for instance, an occupant swings the door open and then the closer brings it back to the closed position. So first of all, it has to be readily openable. Secondly, exit doors are required not to have any locks. Okay. Even though you may be permitted to have electromagnetic locks that release upon the operation of a fire alarm, but in that case, you would have to design the release of the electromagnetic lock in conformance with in conformance with NBC 34616.4. Okay. So this is also an illustration over here. Okay, and it's very clear. So it discusses, for instance, if you have a door release hardware, the maximum height that the hardware has to be installed, and the force that is required to open the door, and the force is required to be not more than 90 newtons. So that brings us to subsection 997 of the NBC, access to exit. Remember, we talked about access to exit, and it's essentially, the definition is in the name, providing access to exit serving the floor area. Okay. Now, an access to exit is required from every roof that is intended for occupancy, from every podium, from a terrace, and then from a platform and contained open space. Okay, so even though a roof may be outside, the floor area of a building because it's open to the exterior, you still need to be able to provide a means of egress from the roof for occupants. Okay. Typically, you are required to provide 2 separate means of egress from any roof that is intended for an occupant load of more than 60 persons. If you have an occupant load not more than 60 persons on the roof that is intended for occupancy, you may have just one means of egress. A means of egress is, remember, a defined term. It includes exits and then access to exit. So if you have an occupied roof, you can either have, for instance, a stair that leads to an exit stair on the floor below, or if you can also have the typical exit, or an exit that is rated and that is constructed as a fire separation to serve the occupants that may find themselves on the roof that is intended for an occupancy. Then we also look at access to exit where you have a floor area that has multiple suites. So a suite is a defined term in the code. So where you have a floor area that contains more than one suite, for instance, let's say we have a 2-story building and we have multiple offices on a story in the building. Each suite in the floor area is required to have an exterior exit doorway, a doorway to a public corridor, or a doorway to an exterior passageway. Okay. Now, where you have a doorway from each suite opening into a corridor, or a public corridor, or an exterior passageway, you have to be able to go in opposite directions to each of 2 separate exits. And the principle behind this is that, in case for some reason the one of the exits is compromised, you still have access to the other exit that is located remote from the exit which is compromised. And this is a requirement for a floor area that contains more than one suite. Still under access to exits for suites. So this section is actually in subsection 9974 of the code, and it discusses, the number of egress doorways, for instance, that are required to be provided for a room or a suite. So depending on the area of the room or suite, the occupancy of the room or suite, and then the travel distance within the room or suite, you may be permitted to have either one egress door or a minimum of 2 egress doors serving that room or suite. So 2 egress doors are required from every suite or room that exceeds any of the criteria in the table that we have below, or where the occupant load in the room or suite is more than 60 persons. Okay. So for instance, if you are in a group D office room or suite, and the even if the area, so let me get back a bit. So for instance, in a group D occupancy, if you have the an area of a suite is more than 200 and the travel distance is more than 25 meters to an egress door, you are required to provide a minimum of 2 egress doors from the room. Okay, so if you have, for instance, a group D office space and the occupant load in that space is not more than 60 persons, which would mean that you can actually have one egress door serving that group D office space, you still have to come back to your table and then check the area of that office space as well as the travel distance to that one egress door that is permitted. Now, if the area of the suite is more than 200, or if the travel distance to that egress door that you are potentially providing is more than 25 meters, then you have to provide 2 egress doors. So again, this is under 9974 of the code, number and spacing of egress doors. So I'm going to hit this again. So depending on the occupant load that you have in a room or a suite, for instance, if you have a room or a suite that has an occupant load of more than 60 persons, the moment you exceed 60, you need to provide a minimum of 2 egress doors from that room or suite. In addition to that, you also have to check NBC table 9974 to check the area of the room or suite and also the travel distance from any point within the room or suite to the egress door. So if the travel distance, for instance, if we are in a group D office space and the travel distance to an egress door is more than 25 meters, you have to provide another egress door to serve that area. If the area of the room or suite in a group D occupancy, for instance, is more than 200 square meters, then you have to provide a minimum of 2 egress doors to serve the room. Okay. The code also has some provisions on dead-end corridors. So if you have a dead-end corridor and it does not exceed 6 meters long, then you are permitted to have that dead-end corridor. Otherwise, you cannot have a dead-end corridor in a suite. So we talked about the requirements for an exit serving a floor area in a building, and then we've also talked about the door swings and how many doors you are required to provide to serve a room or a suite. Okay. The next thing that we need to look at is travel distances. Okay, so in our previous slides, we talked about travel distances for a room or a suite to the egress door that serves the room or suite. And depending on whether the travel distances in NBC table 9974 is exceeded, you may be required to provide a minimum of 2 egress doors. This section 998 is actually looking at the travel distance to an exit. Okay, so the maximum permitted travel distance to an exit, to at least one of the exits in a group D occupancy, is required to be not more than 40 meters. In all other occupancies, it's required to be not more than 30 meters. And then where you have a sprinkled floor area, you are actually allowed to, increase the travel distance by 5 meters. So 45 meters in all occupancies in a sprinkled floor area. Okay. So in a later slide, we will look at how we measure these travel distances. Now, when you have 2 exits provided from a floor area, each exit must contribute not more than 50% of the required exit width. And then exits in a floor area must also be located remote from each other. And the principle behind this is that, you don't want a situation whereby, for instance, if for some reason one of the exits is compromised, you still need to have access to at least one other exit in the floor area. So in this sketch that we have here is just to have a look at how, for instance, we measure the travel distance and all that. So this is a typical floor area that contains 3 suites. Right? So the first thing is that because we have more than one suite, we either have to provide an exterior exit doorway for every suite on this floor area, or we provide a door that opens into a public corridor. Now, once you are in the public corridor, you should have access to 2 exits located in the public corridor, and the exits have to be located remote from each other. Okay, so dead-end corridor maximum 6 meters. So the dead-end corridor is measured from the furthest point of the corridor serving suite 2 to where you have the option to go in another direction. Okay, so once you get to the left edge of suite 3, you can actually make a left turn and then use the exits there. So that's where your dead end ends, and this is required to be not more than 6 meters. Okay, now in measuring your travel distance, you would measure from, so if you take suite 1 for instance, and let's say suite 1 is a group D occupancy, right? So the first thing is, in hindsight, we have just one egress door serving suite 1. So we need to check the area of suite 1 to be sure that it's not more than 200 square meters. And then we also need to check the travel distance to the egress door serving suite 1 to be sure that it does not exceed 25 meters if it is group D. And then also check the occupant load for that suite 1. If the occupant load is not more than 60, then we can maintain that one egress door that we have serving suite 1. We do the same thing for suite 2, suite 3, depending on the occupancy of these suites. Okay. Now, in addition to that, we measure our travel distance from the remotest point in the floor area to the exit there. And for instance, where this floor area is sprinkler protected, that travel distance has to be not more than 45 meters. There are some provisions in the code that will actually allow you to measure the travel distance from, for instance, the egress door of the suite to the exit there, provided the suite is constructed as a fire separation, and also where you have the door opening into a public corridor. Okay, and this is all discussed in 998 of the code. So if you look at 9981 sentence 2, it states that where a room or suite is separated from the remainder of the floor area by a fire separation having a fire resistance rating of 45 minutes, or in a sprinklered building by a fire separation which is not required to be rated, you can measure the travel distance from the egress door of the suite to the nearest exit. Now, there may be cases where, so typically exits, when you have an exit there, it will discharge to the exterior of the building. Now, there may be scenarios where you have your exits there, it's nearly impossible to discharge the exits there to the interior, and the exits there will actually have to discharge through other areas in the building or through a lobby. So Article 9985 of the code discusses exit through a lobby. Okay. So one exit from a floor area above or below the first story is permitted to lead through a lobby. Okay. Then in the event that you have a discharge, an exit stair discharging through a lobby, the lobby must not be more than 4.5 meters above grade. That is the first requirement. The second is that once you open your exit stair into the lobby, the travel distance from the door that is opening into the lobby to the exterior doorway from the lobby shall not exceed 15 meters. On top of that, other occupancies may be permitted to open into the lobby. Occupancies other than service rooms, storage rooms, rooms of residential or industrial occupancy are permitted to open onto the lobby. So if you have a service room or if you have a storage room, it cannot open directly into the lobby that is being used for exiting. And for that matter, you may be required to provide, a vestibule, between the lobby and the service room that is opening onto the lobby. In addition to that, any occupancy that is located adjacent to the lobby is required to be fire separated from the lobby by a fire resistance rating with 45 minutes or by a non-rated fire separation where the occupancies are sprinkler protected. So if you have a sprinklered building and you have a discharge from a stair into a lobby on the ground floor level, for instance, the occupancies that are adjacent to the lobby is required to be non-rated, but it still has to be a fire separation. So the whole idea is that you are leaving an exit, which is the safest area in the building, onto a common area, which is the lobby. So you are essentially designing the lobby similar to an exit stair in the building, and that is why these requirements are in place. In addition to that, you cannot have any seating in the lobby other than seating for a concierge or for seating that you normally find in a lobby in a residential building for security purposes. So this sketch that we have here is also to illustrate how you apply the requirements for the case where you have an exit discharging through a lobby. Okay, so these are office suites, and you have this exit there, the exit on the far right, opening onto the lobby. Okay, the discharge is into a lobby. So assuming this building is sprinkler protected, right? You have to, first of all, you are constructing the lobby similar to an exit, meaning that it would be required to have to be a fire separation or a barrier with a fire resistance rating. Okay. Now, if that building is sprinkled, then the fire separation between the lobby and the adjacent occupancies, which is what we have highlighted as red. For instance, on the left side, there has to be a separation between the lobby and the office. If the building is sprinkled, that separation need not have a fire resistance rating, meaning that it just needs to be a smoke barrier. Okay. If it is not sprinkled, then it needs to have a fire resistance rating, same as the exit. So typically in a building designed to Part 9, your exits would be 45-minute fire resistance rated. So the lobby would have to be constructed as a fire separation with a 45-minute fire resistance rating. The exits there on the far left discharges to the exterior, so this requirement would not be applicable. Now, what if you have a mezzanine? So a mezzanine is an intermediate floor assembly between a floor and a ceiling of any room or story. Okay. Now, this requirement or this provision in the code under Article 9986 is applicable to mezzanines that are not considered as a story. Okay. And the code has discusses when you do not need to consider a mezzanine as a story. We shall get to that later on. Okay. So a mezzanine may be served by an open stair. That is a stair that is not constructed as a fire separation with a fire resistance rating. If the mezzanine need not terminate at a fire separation, if the occupant load of the mezzanine is less than 60 persons, and if the mezzanine meets the area and egress criteria permitted for a single egress door serving a room or a suite. So this last check will take you back to NBC table 9974. So you check the occupancy of the mezzanine, the area of the mezzanine, the travel distance on the mezzanine, and if it meets the provisions that allow one egress door per table 9974, then you can have an open stair serving that mezzanine, provided, of course, the two other criteria above are also satisfied. Okay, so the first is a mezzanine that need not terminate at a fire separation. So that is typically where you have the mezzanine classified as an open mezzanine with an area not exceeding 40% of the room in which it is found, or where it is classified as a closed mezzanine with an area not exceeding 10% of the room in which it is found. Okay. So an open mezzanine is a mezzanine whose area is no more than 40% of the open area of the room in which they are located. And a closed mezzanine is one which is not more than 10% of the floor area of the suite in which they are located. And this is discussed in detail in the code, and that's subsection 910.4, building size determination. So if you look at 910.4.1, it discusses when mezzanines are not considered as stories. And mezzanines that are not considered as stories are not required to terminate at a fire separation. We shall get back to that under the fire protection section of this presentation. So, when are we allowed to have a single exit? So each story in a building of 1 and 2 stories is permitted to be served by a single exit, provided the travel distance taking you back to table 9974 is not exceeded and the occupant load is not more than 60 persons. So if you have, for instance, a 2-story building, you check your travel distance on the first story, you check your travel distance on the second story, depending on the occupancy. If the travel distances in table 974 are not exceeded, and if the occupant load in the floor area is such that it is no more than 60 persons, then you may have just a single exit serving the building. And again, this is applicable where the building is not more than 2 stories in building height. And again, this is typically not applicable to, dwelling units. There is a separate section in the code for egress from a dwelling unit. So that brings us then to egress from dwelling units. Okay, So a dwelling unit is a defined term in the code. Okay, and typically in a multi-story dwelling unit, or where you have a dwelling unit that contains more than one story, you are required to locate the exits and the egress doors such that you do not have to travel up or down more than one story to reach a level that is served by an exterior exit doorway or an egress door that opens into a public corridor. Okay, so I will hit on this again. In a multi-story dwelling unit, exits or egress doors shall be located such that you do not travel up or down more than one story to reach a level served by an egress door into a public corridor or an exterior exit doorway. Part 9 is typically applicable to buildings that do not exceed 3 stories, right? So if you have a 3-story building, your egress from the dwelling unit has to be such that you are not traveling more than one level to get to an access to exit. And the access to exit can be an exterior exit doorway or an egress door into a public corridor. Now, there are some exemptions to this. So, where you have a dwelling unit that is not stacked, okay, the travel limit may exceed 1 story, provided that the floor level is served by an openable window that is located such that the sill of the window is not more than 1 meter above the finished floor and not more than 7 meters above the adjacent ground level. As an alternative, the floor may be provided with an access to a balcony. So if you have a dwelling unit that is, for instance, 2 or 3 stories high, and the dwelling units are not stacked, then you, as an alternative to the first requirement, which requires traveling up or down no more than 1 story, you can have, for instance, on the 3rd story, an openable window that is located not more than 1 meter above the floor and not more than 7 meters above the adjacent ground level. And the whole idea is that when you have these balconies, in the event of a fire, occupants can actually wait on the balcony and then wait for evacuation by the fire department or other authorized personnel. Okay, so this is a sketch again that illustrates egress requirements from dwelling units. Okay, so let's start off from the 1st story. So from the 1st story, we have the exterior doorway serving the 1st story. On the 2nd story, okay, we travel down the stair, the open stair. We travel just 1 story to reach the exterior exit doorway. On the 3rd story, we are traveling more than 1 story, so we have to travel the 2nd story and then the 1st story to get to an exterior exit doorway. So, as an alternative, because we do not meet that requirement, we provide either an openable window that is located not more than 1 meter from the finished floor and that is located not more than 7 meters from the ground level. Or we can have a door that opens into a balcony, and when you have a balcony or an openable window installed on the level that you would have to travel more than 1 story, then you meet the requirements for egress from a dwelling unit. Now that brings us to 9, 9, 10. So where we have egress from multiple dwelling units. Okay. So when you have an egress door, as we discussed earlier on, when you have an egress door from a dwelling unit that opens onto a public corridor or exterior passageway, it has to be possible to travel in opposite directions to two separate exits. So that is what we have over here. Okay, so forget about the exterior exit, the second door up north, for lack of better words. Forget about that for now. So we have to, once you discharge onto the exterior passageway, you need to have the option to go in opposite directions to either of two separate exits, and that is what we have over here. Okay. Now, you do not have to meet this requirement if the dwelling unit is provided with a second and separate means of egress, and that brings us to the other doors that are located up north. Okay, so if you have, as you can see, not necessary to go in opposite direction to separate exits where the dwelling unit has a separate exit and second means of egress. So in this case here, we have each dwelling unit being served by at least two exits or exterior exit doors. Now, when you have a dwelling unit with a shared egress facility, okay, so still under 9993. So shared egress facilities is under 9993 of the code. Okay. Again, this is not applicable to dwelling units in a house with a secondary suite. Okay. So a dwelling unit shall be provided with a second and separate means of egress, where an egress door from the dwelling unit opens onto an exit stair that serves more than one suite. So that is a shared egress facility. Or a public corridor that serves more than one suite. That is also a shared egress facility. Or an exterior passageway or balcony serving more than one suite, served by a single stair or ramp, and that is more than 1.5 meters above ground level. So that is more or less linked to our previous slide where we had, the doors from the dwelling units opening into an exterior passageway that is shared between the two dwelling units. And for that matter, you would have to provide a second and separate means of egress from the dwelling units. So again, as an example, we have a second floor dwelling unit and then we have a first floor dwelling unit. Okay, so the second floor dwelling unit is discharging through an exit stairway that is also serving, that is shared with the first dwelling unit. Okay, and because of that, we need to provide a second and separate means of egress because we have a shared egress facility. Okay, and this chart here illustrates this requirement in 9993 of the code, where you have a shared egress facility in a dwelling unit. Again, this is not applicable to dwelling units in a house with a secondary suite. Egress from bedrooms. So the requirements for egress from bedrooms is to allow use of a window or a door from the bedroom as a means of escape in case a fire prevents use of the building's normal exits. Okay, so in unsprinkled dwelling units, each bedroom must have at least one outside window or exterior door that can be used as a means of egress to the outside in the event that the normal exit serving the building is there, in the event that there is no access or for some reason there is limited access to the normal exit serve in the building. Okay. Now, the requirements for the window or exterior door that is providing a means of escape from the bedroom is that it must be openable from the inside without requiring keys or specialized knowledge, and it must have an unobstructed opening of not less than 0.35 square meters with no dimension less than 380 millimeters. Okay. Now, the code does not really discuss, how you locate your the window. The most important thing is that this window is able to provide a means of escape from the bedroom. So the only requirement that it talks about is the area of the opening and then the minimum dimension of the opening, which is 0.35 square meters with no dimension less than 380 millimeters, right? There is no other requirement on how you locate a window. But there is a suggestion in notes A991012, okay? And the suggestion is that, for instance, where you have, typically on a basement story where you have a window well, okay? You need to, what you can do is you can have a sill height of 1.5 meters for the window, or if you can, for some reason, have a built-in furniture under the window to facilitate use as a means of escape. The code actually identifies, the difficulty in trying to meet this requirement, and for that matter, it has that suggestion in note A9910(1) of the code. It's just a suggestion.
Just imagine escaping from that.
Okay. Now, where the window providing the means of escape from the bedroom opens into a window well, typically for basement areas, a clearance of 760 millimeters is required to be provided in front of the window. Okay, and that is an illustration over here. So you have the window, this is your window wall, and then you have a clearance of 760 millimeters to facilitate, egress from the bedroom once an occupant uses the window as a means of escape. Now, lastly, we look at signage for exits that serve a building. So the first thing is that obviously exits must be visible at all times. Okay, and that is why we provide signage. Okay, obviously this is not applicable to dwelling unit or a house with a secondary suite. So if you read 9911(1), this subsection applies to all exits except those serving not more than one dwelling unit or a house with a secondary suite. Okay. Exit signs are required over every exit door that serves a building that is 3 stories in height, a building that has an occupant load of more than 150, or a room or floor area that has a fire escape as part of the means of egress. Now, in a 3-story building, the exit signs must be provided to indicate that a stair does not exit above or below the lowest exit level. And this is to avoid any confusion, when someone is using the exit stair, we are trying to make him aware that, the exit stair does not lead to an exit at the roof level, and it does also not lead to an exit at the basement level. And then assigned floor numbers must also be mounted on the stair side of the wall at the latch side of doors in an exit stair. The code also has some requirements for, lighting. Obviously your exits have to be, clearly visible. So exits and access to exit corridors are required to be illuminated to an average level of 50 lux and a minimum level of 10 lux at the floor level or at the tread level where you have an exit stair. Emergency lighting of 10 lux is required to be provided for 30 minutes in all exits, access to exits, and principal routes that provide access to exits in open floor areas. Again, this is not applicable to dwelling units or a house with a secondary suite. And that brings us to the end of our presentation and the means of egress. I will do well to answer all your questions under the Q&A section. So without wasting much time, we will move on to fire protection. So under fire protection, we will discuss items that are under Part 3 of the code. Okay, so even though we are looking at Part 9 under fire protection, certain items are referenced back to Part 3 of the code. So Part 9 of the code is obviously not applicable to assembly occupancies. So if you have an assembly occupancy, you have to go to Part 3 to check for the requirements for fire protection. Okay. Part 9 of the code is also not applicable to basements that contain more than one story or basements that exceed 600 meters square in area. And also, where you are sprinkler protecting a building designed to Part 9 and where you are providing standpipe systems in the building, the design of the sprinkler and then the standpipe system would have to conform to Part 3 of the code. There are other items that also fall under Part 3 of the code, and this is discussed in detail under Article 9.10.13 of the NBC. So fire resistance rating. Service rooms and service spaces. So in an unsprinklered building, service rooms are required to be fire separated from the remainder of the building by 1 hour fire resistance rated construction. Now, if you have a room that contains a fuel fired appliance, it is required to be fire separated from the remainder of the building by 1 hour fire resistance rated construction. This is under 9.10.10 of the code. A service room is also a defined term in the code. Now, this section applies to all service rooms except rooms that are located within a dwelling unit or a service room that serves just a dwelling unit. Rooms containing incinerators are also required to be fire separated from the remainder of the building by 2 hour fire resistance rated construction. Okay. An incinerator shall not be located in a room with other fuel fired appliances because then there is the potential for a fire to occur in the room. The code also discusses the required fire resistance rating for a storage room or a garbage room. Typically, garbage rooms will be provided with a 1 hour fire resistance rating in a non-sprinklered floor area or a 45-minute fire resistance rating if the rooms are sprinkler protected. The code under 9.10.9, if you read the code under 9.10, it discusses other applicable, fire resistance rating requirements, under the construction requirements, for instance, fire resistance rating of the floor assemblies. That is under table 9.10.8.1, where depending on the occupancy, you may be required to provide 45-minute fire resistance rating for the floor assemblies. That was not captured in the slides, but I'm just drawing your attention to that. Subsection 9.10.11, firewalls. So firewalls are special fire separations that typically subdivide a building into 2 or more for the separate portions to be considered as separate buildings for the purpose of fire protection. Okay. So a firewall to divide a building into separate buildings shall have a fire resistance rating of not less than 2 hours. The firewall is required to be designed to Part 3 of the code, under 3.1.10, where it discusses the construction of the firewall. For instance, it can be masonry, concrete, or any material that passes S101. And where you have a party wall of 1 hour fire resistance rating, it is permitted to separate 2 dwelling units with no dwelling units located above the other. And it's also permitted to separate a dwelling unit and a house or 2 houses. Okay. So if a building extends across a property line and let's say the portion on each side is under different ownership, then you will be looking at a party wall on the property line, and this party wall is required to be constructed as a firewall. Okay. And however, this is not applicable where the portion of the building that extends across a different property line is functioning as one, Prevention of fire spread at exterior walls and between stories. So the first thing is that typically floor areas are required to terminate at an exterior wall, a firewall, or a vertical shaft. And typically, for instance, if you have a 2-story or a 3-story building and the construction requirement is such that the floor assemblies are required to be constructed as fire separations, in order to maintain the compartmentation of each story, the floor areas would have to, it's either they are terminating at an exterior wall, a firewall, a vertical shaft, or a vertical fire separation that has the same fire resistance rating as the floor assembly. And what do we need? So this is an illustration to this requirement. So this is a 2-story. Okay, we have the basement, we have the first floor, we have the second floor. Okay, portions of the basement is terminating at a firewall or a vertical fire separation with a fire resistance rating. Okay, the right side of the basement is terminating at an exterior wall, so we meet that requirement. On the first floor level, we are terminating at a firewall or a fire separation with a fire resistance rating. The right side is terminating at an exterior wall, so we also meet that requirement. On the second story, if you look at it, just for illustration purposes, the left side is terminating at a vertical shaft, and the right side, which is not terminating at the firewall or at the exterior wall, is actually terminating at a vertical fire separation required to have a fire resistance rating. So the only time that you are not required to meet these requirements is when you have a mezzanine that is not required to be constructed as a story, and then you can have the floor assembly for the mezzanine not terminating either at an exterior wall or a firewall or a vertical fire separation with a fire resistance rating. Now back to our discussion on potential exposure issues. When you have 2 fire compartments and the exterior walls of these fire compartments intersect at an angle less than 135 degrees, okay, then what we are saying is that the area of the portion of the wall, within 1.2 millimeters should have the same fire resistance rating as required for the interior fire separation. So again, this is under Article 9, 10, 12, 3 of the code. Okay. So where exterior walls of a building meet at an external angle of 135 degrees or less, the horizontal distance from one unprotected opening to the other unprotected opening shall not be less than 1.2 meters where these openings are in a different fire compartment or in different dwelling units. Again, this is to prevent fire spread from one fire compartment to another fire compartment, because a compartment is required to function as such, and to that's why we have fire separations. For instance, between a public corridor and a residential suite, you would have a 45-minute fire resistance rated separation between the corridor and the residential suite. So you don't want a situation whereby there is the potential for fire to spread from the public corridor to the residential unit and vice versa. Also, as an additional requirement to prevent fire spread at exterior walls and between stories, the code also addresses protection of soffits. This is not applicable to sprinkler buildings. Okay. Now, the protection of soffits requirement in 9.10.12.4 is applicable to portion of a soffit enclosing a projection that is less than 2.5 meters vertically above a window or floor, such that if there is a fire and you have flames projecting out of the window, it can hit the soffit and then spread to an adjacent suite in the building. And soffit enclosing a projection that is less than 1.2 meters from either side of the window or door. So we will see what we mean by that in the next slide. So the soffit discussed above shall have no unprotected openings and shall be protected where the soffit encloses a common attic or roof space that spans more than 2 suites of residential occupancy and projects beyond the exterior wall of the building. A floor space where an upper story projects beyond the exterior wall of a lower story and a fire separation is required at the floor between the 2 stories, or the floor separates 2 dwelling units from each other. A floor space where an upper story projects beyond the exterior wall of a lower story and the projection is continuous across a vertical fire separation separating 2 suites or a wall. So again, this is in Article 9.10.12.4 of the code, and just to have a better view of what the code is trying to achieve. So as I said earlier on, it is applicable where you have to the portion of the soffit that is beyond 1.2 meters of the window opening, and that is 2.5 meter or less above the window opening. So if you look at the sketch on the right hand side, so bullet 1, we have a window in a residential suite, okay, and the soffit is less than 2.5 meters above the window. So we protect the soffit up to 1.2 meters beyond the window opening. Okay. Now, where you have a common attic or roof space that spans more than 2 suites of residential occupancy, there is the potential for a fire in one of the residential occupancies to spread to the other occupancy through the soffit. So you also have to protect, the soffit. Okay. Now, soffit protection is not required if you have fire stopping of the to separate the soffit from the roof or attic space, or if you have if there is a separation between the assembly that separates the attic space from the stories below, then you do not have to protect the soffit. Okay. Now, how do we protect the soffit? So protection will be by a non-combustible material with a thickness of 0.38 millimeters and a melting point not less than 650 degrees Celsius. You can also use your regular half-inch gypsum soffit board or gypsum board that is installed in accordance with the CSA standard. And you can also use an 11 millimeter thick plywood or 12.5 millimeter thick OSB, oriented stranded board, or wafer board, or 11 millimeter thick lumber. So again, this is discussed in Article 9.10.12.4 of the code, and it lists, the materials that may be used to protect the soffit to prevent fire spread to adjacent suites or to the attic space. Now, fire blocking. So fire blocking is typically when you have a concealed space, we want to have provisions in place to prevent fire spread through the concealed space to the adjacent building. So fire blocking is discussed in 9.10.16 of the code. Okay. Now, a fire block is a defined term, and it's a material component or system that will restrict the spread of fire within a concealed space. Okay. So 9.10.16 discusses fire blocking in a vertical service space and also in a horizontal service space. So vertical concealed spaces in walls are required to be separated by fire blocks, one from the other, and from horizontal concealed spaces. And then horizontal concealed spaces in attics, roof spaces, ceilings, floors, and crawl spaces are also to be separated by fire blocks from the other and from a vertical concealed space. So, as an illustration, we have an attic space, and then we have fire blocking between the attic space and then the adjacent vertical concealed space. Okay. In this second example too, we have a vertical concealed space. So we fire block this vertical concealed space from that concealed space, and then we also fire block the joist space, which is also a concealed space, from the horizontal and vertical concealed space below. Now, when you have a concealed space in a mansard or gambrel style roof, okay, exterior cornices, balconies, and canopies of combustible construction, in which the construction material within the space have a surface flame spread rating of more than 25, the concealed spaces shall have vertical fire blocks at intervals of not more than 20 meters and at points where the concealed spaces extend across the ends of required vertical fire separations. So what do we mean? So in plan view, we have this roof assembly here. We have fire separations, which are the hidden lines. Okay, so we fire stop the concealed space of combustible construction. That's assuming the concealed space has some combustible materials in there, and the flame spreading of the combustible material in there is exceeds 25. Then we fire block at intervals of 20 meters in the concealed space within the mansard or the gambrel roof. Fire blocking is also required at intersections between vertical and horizontal concealed spaces, as we discussed above. To maintain the integrity of our exit fire separations, we also need fire blocking at the top and bottom of each run of stairs and in a ceiling or roof space or unoccupied attic in an unsprinkled building, so that each compartment created by the fire blocking is not more than 60 meters in the greatest dimension and not more than 300 meters squared in area. Still under fire blocking in concealed spaces. So when you have a wall, concealed spaces in walls are required to be fire blocked at every floor level, and then at each ceiling level, where the ceiling is actually a membrane with a fire resistance rating, or where the ceiling forms part of an assembly required to be a fire separation. And at other locations within the wall, so that the distance between fire blocks is no more than 20 meters horizontally and 3 meters vertically. Again, the intent of these requirements is to cannot limit the potential for a fire to spread through the concealed spaces to other areas of the building. Excuse me. So as an illustration, we fire block the wall at the floor level, as you can see, and where you have a ceiling that forms part of an assembly required to be a fire separation with a fire resistance rating, you also fire block at the ceiling level. Now, fire blocking is not required in walls that are insulated, okay, provided the insulated wall contains not more than one concealed airspace whose horizontal thickness is more than 25 millimeters. Or when you have the exposed construction material in the wall is non-combustible. The exposed construction material within the space, including insulation, but not including wiring, piping, or similar devices, have a flame spread rating of no more than 25. So with a flame spread rating of no more than 25, then there is basically no way of fire spreading through the material because the flame spread rating is that low. And the concealed wall space is filled with insulation. So these are the waivers for not fire blocking the wall assembly. So, and this is an illustration here because we have insulation in here. We are not fire blocking this concealed space and then the concealed space in the wall. And this is just an image showing a typical fire block. So fire blocking is essentially, you are essentially creating fire compartments within the concealed space. And the whole idea is that this compartmentation of the concealed space is able to limit, fire spread through the concealed space to other areas in the building. So what materials can be used as fire blocks? So fire blocks may be constructed of 0.38 millimeter sheet steel, gypsum wallboard, plywood, 38 millimeter lumber, or 2 layers of 19 millimeter lumber with joint staggered. Again, this is in 9.10.16 of the code. Interior finishes. So interior finishes is also a very interesting subject because we want to be able to limit the flame spread through a building. So when you have a building, in addition to constructing most of the elements in the building as fire separations with fire resistance rating, there may also be some limitations on the flame spread rating of the finishes on the walls, ceilings, and floors of the building. So typically in a building designed to Part 9, interior finish requirements under 9.10.17 are not applicable to the finishes on the floor, but the finishes on the walls and ceilings are required to have a flame spread rating that is not more than 150. Typically doors are required to have a flame spread rating of 200 or not more than 200. Any portion of the exit is required to have a flame spread rating not more than 25 for the finishes. Protection of foamed plastics. So sometimes you may have foamed plastic in, for instance, in your wall assembly or even for insulating your building. Foam plastics in walls or ceilings are required to be protected by either of the following: by plywood, gypsum board, sheet metal, plaster, or hardboard. Basically the same materials that you could use for fire blocking. Now, protection of foamed plastics is discussed in 9.10.17.10 of the code. We also want to cover just the basics under, firefighter access to buildings. So to provide access for fire department to the building. We provide access through a street, a private roadway, or a yard. Um, the detailed requirements for this is discussed in 9.10.20 of the code. Okay. Now, access for firefighting is required to be provided to every story in the building and to every basement, either through doors or access panels. Access panels are required to have a minimum dimension of 1100 millimeters high and 550 millimeters wide, and a cell height of not more than 900 millimeters above the floor. And that brings us to the end of our presentation today. So if you have any questions, I will try as much as possible to answer the questions that you have. Thank you.
There's so many.
Is he still going to do the questions?
Yeah, he was pretty thorough actually.
He was good.
He was really good. It might be really good just to go through this and like tag it once more by yourself.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do.
I think that's what I'm gonna do. Just study part 9. Just really
I feel like I'm going to not do. I don't know. Maybe later.
the night before.
Like after CCDC, after.
Yeah, so we will go through the questions that were asked and try to answer them. So question 1, can you please specify the full articles for this part of the webinar? Yeah, so I believe I did specify the or reference the articles. Most of them are covered in 9.9 and 9.10 of the code. So there is a question on how about the doors to individual units. So I believe this is related to the door swing. So the door swing is typically not applicable to dwelling units containing a house or secondary suite. So the swing is applicable where you have an occupant load of it has to swing in the direction of exit travel where you have an occupant load of 60 or more. So question, how is the 3-meter horizontal dimension measured? Edge or center of windows. So 99451B. So I believe this is with regards to exterior fire spread. So that 3-meter distance is measured from the edge of the 2 window openings. So I believe I had let's try and go back up to this. Yeah, so it is. I mean, it's we recommend measuring from the edge of the window. It's more conservative, to measure that 3-meter distance from the edge of the window opening. Next question is, how do we protect a window? So when you are required to protect a window to prevent or to limit exterior fire spread, so the window can either be wired glass or glass blocks which have inherent fire protection rating, or it can be a closure with a fire protection rating of 45 minutes. Could you give an example of an occupancy in a corridor? So sorry, I had to pause on that for a second. So an occupancy in a corridor could be, for instance, a lounge within the corridor, or where you have a vestibule, or just a typical occupancy within the corridor, and you still require to maintain the required width of the path of travel through that corridor, which is 1100 millimeters. Question 7997, exit from roof. Would you explain more in Q&A? Yeah, so exiting from a roof. So that is under 997 of the code. Yeah. So when you have a roof that is intended to be occupied, let's say you have, an assembly space on the roof. Now you are required to obviously have a means of egress from the roof. Now the means of egress can either be for instance, an exit that is constructed to meet the full requirements of an exit fire separation, or it can be, for instance, an access to an exit on the floor immediately below the roof. So you can have a stair that leads to the, an exit stair enclosure on the floor area below the roof. And the whole idea is that you have to be able to, have a means of leaving the roof in the event that there is a fire on there. Question 8, how far does the second door need to be provided? Yeah, so I believe this is related to when you are required to have 2 egress doors from a room or a suite. So part 9 of the code is very silent on this. It just says that they have to be remote from each other. But you can apply the same principle that is used in part 3 of the code, where you measure the maximum diagonal dimension of the room or suite, and then locate these 2 doors remote from each other by a distance of not less than 1/3 of this maximum diagonal dimension. Under part 9, it only states that, they have to be remote from each other, or they have to be such that in the event that one of them is compromised, you still have access to the other egress door from the room or suite. Question 9 is 99712. So 99712 states, roof intended for occupant load more than 60 people need to have at least 2 separate means of egress. Where in the NBC does it state 60 people or more related to table 9974 for suites? So, sorry, I'm just going to pause on that for a second. So back to the question on the table 9974 for suites. So table 9974 actually just discusses the maximum area of the room or suite and the maximum distance to the egress door. And again, this is for egress provisions from a room or a suite. Now, when you have an occupant load of more than 60 people, then when you read NBC 99822 sentence 2, it talks about having 2 exits where the occupant load served by an exit facility exceeds 60 persons. So I believe that answers the question. Question 10 is, do we calculate the travel distance from the door of the suite or from inside the suite? So typically, so 2 things. So when you're doing the travel distance to determine the egress doors from a suite, you do it for the suite. You measure from the remotest point in the suite or room to the egress door serving the suite. Now, when you are checking the travel distance to an exit, you do it from the remotest point in the floor area to the exit, unless where you have the suite constructed as a fire separation for the fire resistance rating in a non-sprinklered building, or in a sprinklered building where the suite is constructed as a fire separation without a fire resistance rating, and the egress door from the suite opens into a public corridor. Then in that case, you can measure the travel distance from the egress door to the suite to the exit there. Question 11 is 998. What about a 25-meter travel distance? So I'll pause on that for a while. Yeah, so I'm back. So question 11, 998, what about a 25-meter travel distance? Explain more. So the 25-meter travel distance, so 25-meter travel distance comes in under table 9974 for group D. Occupancy, where you check in the minimum number of egress doors that you need to provide from a suite, that is group D. And then it also comes in where you have a 2-story suite. And sorry, I'm just looking for the code reference for that. I'll pause for a second and get you the code. Reference. Okay, apologies for that. Yeah, so the code reference is 9947, stairways in 2-story, and I believe you're talking about the requirements on the maximum travel distance of 25 meters. So where you have a 2-story group D or E building that conforms to the requirements under 9947. So that 25-meter travel distance is measured from any point in the suite to an exterior exit. So if you have a 2-story, you measure from the remotest point. You also measure from the remotest point on level 2 down the open stairs to the exterior exit door serving that on the ground floor level. I believe that answers your question. Yeah, so I'll go over that again. So that requirement under 9947 for stairways in 2-story group D or E buildings. So that 25-meter travel distance, is measured from any point in the suite to an exterior exit. So you would have to measure down the open stairs as well to the exterior exit door on the ground floor level. Our next question is Where are we? 998, question 12. 99851. Could you explain again? So 99851. So exiting through a lobby. Yeah, so let's take for instance you have a 3-story building and you have 2 exit stairs, for instance, serving every floor area or every story in the building. One of the exit stairs discharges directly to the exterior. The other exit stair is discharging within the building, is discharging through a lobby. So the code allows you to have one exit stair serving a floor area above the ground floor level to discharge, or below the ground floor level to discharge through a lobby. So, for instance, if on the second floor level, if we have 2 exits, we cannot have both exits discharging through the lobby, so that is one. So only one of them is permitted to discharge through a lobby. In addition to that, because you are leaving for the exit discharging through the lobby, because you are leaving your exit enclosure to a common area, which is the lobby, you are leaving the confines of the exit, which is the safest area in the building. So you have to design the lobby to conform to the requirements for exit. Okay. Now, in addition to that, the lobby is required to be, fire separated from the adjacent occupancies that are permitted to open onto the lobby. In a sprinkled floor area, that fire separation need not have a fire resistance rating. But other than that, if you have a non-sprinkled area, the adjacent occupancy has to be fire separated from the lobby by a fire separation with a fire resistance rating, which is typically 45 minutes for a building that is built to Part 9. And passenger elevators are also permitted to open onto the lobby. The lobby referred to in sentence 1 shall conform in all respects to the requirements for exit, which is what I just discussed, except that other rooms are actually permitted to open onto the lobby. However, if you have a service room, a storage room, or rooms of residential or industrial occupancy, they are not permitted to open directly onto the lobby that is being used for exit discharge. Again, a lobby is not a defined term. A lobby could be a vestibule. The most important thing is that if your exit is discharging within the building, it's not discharging to the exterior, then you apply the same requirements in 9985 for exiting through a lobby. So in that case, the vestibule or the area within the building that the exit is discharging into must conform to 9985 exiting through a lobby. I believe this answers your question. Next question is, what is a non-rated fire separation? Is it a smoke separation? Yeah, so a non-rated fire separation is just a smoke barrier. Question 14, difference between exit corridor, lobby, and then a public corridor. So these terms actually can get a bit confusing. So an exit corridor can be, an extended portion of an exit that is designed to have the same fire separation and fire resistance rating requirements as an exit stair. So I'll give you an example. For instance, there may be situations whereby you cannot achieve the 45-meter travel distance. For instance, in a sprinkled floor area where you cannot achieve a required 45-meter travel distance to an exit stair. So in that case, what you can do is you can provide what we call, for instance, an exit corridor, extend this exit corridor from the exit stair to the portion of the floor area where you can meet the 45-meter travel distance. So that exit corridor essentially becomes part of the exit enclosure. Okay. A lobby is not a defined term in the code, and as I said earlier on, the requirements in 9985 exiting through a lobby is applicable where your exit discharge from the floor areas above or below the ground floor level do not discharge to the outside. Okay, so if you discharge and exit serving the floor areas above in the building on the ground floor level, then the area that you are discharging into needs to conform to the requirements of 9985. A public corridor is, however, a defined term in the code. And a public corridor is, a corridor that serves multiple suites in a building. So there is a difference between a public corridor and a corridor used by the public. So an example is, if on a floor area I have, let's say, more than 2 or more than 1 dwelling unit, and let's say it's on the second story, these dwelling units would have to discharge into a public corridor. Okay. However, if I have a corridor within, for instance, within an assembly space or within an office suite, that corridor is not a public corridor. It's rather a corridor used by the public. I hope this clarifies these definitions that tend to be confusing sometimes. So slide 1. Next question is difference between lobby and vestibule. So I believe I answered that question in the in my discussion on exiting through a lobby. So a lobby and a vestibule, they are not defined terms in the code. It depends on how you're using it in your building. Another question related to lobby. So again, it's not a defined term in the code, but if you're talking about it in terms of 9985, then I believe I already clarified that for the previous question. Are we allowed to open door to exit stair shaft? Yeah, so you are permitted to open a door to an exit stair shaft, provided the door is not serving a service room or a storage room or a washroom. If the door is serving the door that is opening into the stairs, serving a storage room, a service room, or a washroom, you need to provide access through a vestibule. Travel distance and area in mezzanine are from the second floor or just the first floor. So this will be applicable to the mezzanine area. So you measure the travel distance on the mezzanine, and where it exceeds the maximum travel distance to egress door or the area of the room or suite, then you cannot have an open stair serving that mezzanine. I believe that answers your question. What article does 998 single exit pertain to? So let me go back to 998 single exit. So a single exit is actually where, for instance, if you have a 2-story building, and it's a very small building, right? Then if you can meet the travel distances in 9974 and where the occupant load in the building is very low, and what I mean by very low is it's not more than 60 persons, then you can have one exit serving that floor area. Typically, in most occasions, you are required to have 2 exits from a floor area in a building. But when the building is very small, such that you can accommodate the travel distances in table 9974 depending on the occupancy, then you can have a single exit. For instance, a single stair shaft serving the floor areas in the building that is no more than 2-story building height. Next question. So clarification on the 60 people limit. So the 60 people limit is the total occupant load in the entire building. It's not per story. So yeah. So if the total occupant load in the entire building is not exceeding 60 persons, then you can have that single exit. Next question is, Question 99, Article 9991. So I'll just flip my code. So egress from dwelling units. Can we use a balcony or window as an exit? I believe I answered this question. So yeah, so if you have a balcony or an openable window, then you do not need to meet the requirement to travel not more than one level to reach an exit facility. Okay, so that is the alternative to not meeting the requirement to travel no more than one story to get to an exit facility. Next question is still under 999, third floor egress, 1 meter above the third floor, okay, and 7 meters above adjacent ground. This will clash with guard requirements in the code. You need to have a restrictor of not openable. How do we solve this? So I'll pause on that for a second.
Where's the span table?
Charlie, stop.
That'd be a great question. Just disappeared.
Maybe he could ask if you're using
Okay, so I'm back. So clash with the guard requirements. So there are exemptions in the code. When you read 9881 sentence 5, it discusses the exemptions that windows need not be protected in accordance with sentence 4, which is where you may require a guard, where the window serves a dwelling unit that is not located above another suite. Okay, and where the window serves a house with a secondary suite. In addition to that, where the only opening greater than 100 millimeters by 380 millimeters is a horizontal opening at the top of the window, and where the window sill is located more than 450 millimeters above the finished floor. So the requirement is that you locate it at 1 meters above the finished floor, so that will meet the exemption requirements for not requiring a guard because the window sill is located more than 450 millimeters above the finished floor on one side of the window. Again, this is in 9881 sentence 5. Next question is, please explain more on third floor balcony and door as egress. So I'll go back to that sketch. So the this is actually Sorry. So egress from dwelling units. So it's in subsection 999 of the code. Okay. So if you have a dwelling unit if you have a multi-story dwelling unit, the requirement is that you need to be able to travel not more than one story to get to an exit facility. This exit facility could be an exterior exit doorway or a door that opens into a public corridor. Okay. So if you have a two-story dwelling unit, you literally meet this requirement. The question is when you have a third-story dwelling unit. So for a three-story dwelling unit, occupants on the third story will actually travel 2 stories to get to an exterior exit doorway, right? So the way around this is to provide either a balcony on the third story, or you provide an openable window on the third story. And the intent is that, if for some reason the access to the exterior exit doorway on the main level is compromised, then they can have a temporary area of refuge provided by the balcony, to enable, for instance, firefighters to get them off the building. Next question is mistake on slide 130. It should be 9992 separate exit. Again, apologies if there is a mistake on any of the slides. Sometimes it's an oversight. We will do well to rectify this. And if we have to update the slide, we will update the slide and send it back to you. Question 23. When can a window be an exit? Is it just in the case you showed us, like a second exit in a dwelling unit? Are there other cases? In my experience, yeah, when you are using, you can use the windows as an exit from a dwelling unit. Other than that, you need your typical exit, which is either an exterior exit doorway or an exit stair. Regarding 9.10.1.3, only the fire rating for these elements or spaces are regulated by Part 3, but the building itself remains Part 9. That's the question. So 9.10.1.3. Yeah, so 9.10.1.3, so it's basically the building. So typically, for instance, if you have a building that is entirely an assembly occupancy, it cannot be under Part 9 because Part 9 building is not applicable to assembly. But for instance, if you have a residential building that is under Part 9 and then there is an assembly occupancy in there, the assembly occupancy would have to conform to Part 3. Okay, so the items under Part 3 jurisdiction is just saying that even though your building is being classed as a Part 9 building, depending on what you're looking at, some items may fall under the fire protection requirements in Part 3 of the code. And an example is, as we indicated, where you have a basement that has more than 1 story or exceeding 600 meters square in area. In this case, remember, in classifying the building, we classify it based on the building area and the height of the building measured above grade. So it remains a Part 9 and the basement would have to be Part. So it's not just the fire rating for these elements that need to be Part 3. Is any applicable requirements in the code, any requirements in the code that is applicable to that specific item in a Part 9 building that is required to be under Part 3 jurisdiction. Next question is, if we have a 2-story building and less than 600 meters square having residential occupancy, let's say we have a small restaurant in the ground floor, would the building fall under Part 3 or Part 9? So if so part 9 building is where your building is not more than 3 stories in building height, and the building area is not more than 600 meters square, you are permitted to apply part 9 of the code. Again, that brings us to the items under part 3 jurisdiction. So if your restaurant is an A2 occupancy, then that restaurant space would have to conform to the provisions in part 3 of the code. And then your entire building can still be classified as residential. Typically, when you have an assembly occupancy, it may be considered as subsidiary to the residential occupancy, so it wouldn't make much difference. And it's not a major occupancy as well, 9, 10, 12. So question 26, 9, 10, 12. Can the floor sheeting run through party wall? So 9, 10, 12. Can the floor sheeting run through it? So I believe your question is with regards to termination of floors or mezzanine. So the firewall has to be an independent, the party wall has to be an independent construction, and it has to be able to stand on its own. So the floor sheeting would have to terminate at the party wall. It cannot run through it. It would have to terminate at it, and then make sure that if there are any openings between the party wall and then your floor, you fire stop it as required by the code. Still under 9, 10, 12, protection of soffit is required even if we extend the attic separation to the eave. I'll pause on that. Yeah, so back to the question on the where the attic separation extends to the eave. So if the fire separation, for instance, if you fire separate the attic from the story below, and the fire separation extends to the eave, then the whole idea is that you have a construction that is able to limit fire spread. So then you do not have to protect the soffit. Other than that, if the construction is not a fire separation, then you still have to protect the portion of the soffit that extends to the eave. I believe this answers your question. What is the difference between a fire block and a fire stop? So these are two defined terms in the code. So fire blocks is typically applicable to concealed spaces in a building. The idea behind fire blocking and fire stopping is to limit fire spread to other areas in the building for fire blocking through the concealed space, for fire stopping through openings in the fire separation. So these two terms are defined in the code. A fire block is a material component or system that will restrict the spread of fire within a concealed space. And then a fire stop is the material that is used to fill gaps between fire separations and other assemblies or around openings, around penetrating items in a fire separation. Next question is for slide page 97. So I'll go to page 97 of the slide. Sorry, I'll pause on that for a second. Yeah, so slide page 97. Which one is slide page 97? Again, so you're talking about the fire resistance rating of the floor assembly which it serves. So, okay, I believe this is related to the fire separation requirements for the exit, right? So, if, as I said earlier on in a part 9 building, your exit stair fire separation would have to have a minimum fire resistance rating of 45 minutes. If for some reason, let's say you have the floor assembly on the second floor level is 1 hour rated, then the exit serving that floor has to be 1 hour rated as well. So that is how the context of the fire resistance rating of the floor assembly, which it serves, is explained. What is the code reference for the 2-hour firewall requirements? So part 9 has very generic this discussion on firewalls. So under part 9 it talks about party walls, that is party walls that are required to be 1 hour, but firewalls required to be 2 hour is actually discussed in 3.1.10 of the code. So if you go to 3.1.10 of the code, it discusses firewall and requires firewalls under 3.1.10 to requires firewalls to have a fire resistance rating of no less than 2 hours. So also under section 9.10.11.3 of the code, part 9 of the code, it references you back to part 3. So where firewalls are used, the requirements in part 3 are applicable. On page 132, sorry, page 132, which one is page 132? But the question is, I assume the first floor unit would also need a secondary and separate means of egress. So if this is in context with the required, means of egress doors from a suite or a room, then, basically what you have to do is to check the travel distance and also to check the maximum area of the room or suite served. So if the values in the table are exceeded, then you have to provide a secondary and a separate means of egress from the room. Question 32. In regards to 99812, is there a situation where the exit corridor would not be rated with multiple suites? Can you give an example? So regards to 9981. So I'll pause on that for a second. So yeah, so a typical example would be, for instance, where you have, let's say, a small assembly occupancy in a residential floor area, and this assembly occupancy is not a major occupancy, with an emphasis on major occupancy. So typically, public corridors are required to be 45-minute rated, fire resistance rated, and separated from the remainder of the story. But in a sprinkled floor area, okay, the portion of a public corridor between this assembly occupancy, which is not a major occupancy under Part 9, and the public corridor is actually permitted to be just a fire separation without a fire resistance rating. Okay, so in that context, the separation between the assembly occupancy and the public corridor that is allowing you to measure your travel distance from the egress door would not be required to be rated. Again, this is, if the public corridor is separating, if the separation is between a public corridor and a residential occupancy, it would have to have a fire resistance rating. Question 33. Say a 400 square meter two-story type A2 on sprinkled building intends to have a 100 square meter residential unit at the second floor. So again, if you have a 400 square meter two-story type A2 on sprinkled building, so the moment you have an A2 major occupancy, that takes you out of Part 9. So you have to go to Part 3. And on top of that, the A2 occupancy would be the governing construction requirement. So it's either, unless you have the residential located entirely below the A2 occupancy would have to apply to the entire building. Again, I believe this will be covered in Part 3 of the webinar. Can the allowable unprotected opening under Part 3 apply to Part 9? So I do not know the context of this question, but I'll pause for a second. Yeah, so back to that question, can the allowable unprotected opening, I believe this is under the context of spatial separation. So yeah, you can apply the requirements in Part 3 for spatial separation to a building that is designed to Part 9. It's actually, I want to, hold on a second, I'm just going to find you that reference. So back again, that is under sentence 9.10.14.4. Openings in exposing building faces, where it tells you that unprotected openings can actually conform to either the table in Part 9 of the code or to subsection 323 of the code. Question number 35. Slide access to exit suites. What does it mean for occupancy C that say except dwelling units? Yeah, so what we mean by except dwelling units is the code has very specific, provisions for egress from a dwelling unit. So unless you have multiple dwelling units, meaning you have multiple suites in a floor area in a building where you have to comply with the requirements for instance, egress opening into egress doors opening into a public corridor or having an exterior exit doorway from each dwelling unit, then the provisions on there are not applicable. I believe this answers your question. So I believe that answers your question. Question 36. Where does it say that it's okay to have an elevator in the lobby? So I believe this is related to exiting through the lobby. So it says you can open an elevator into the lobby in 998. So hold on a second also. Under 9985 sentence 5. So passenger elevators are permitted to open onto the lobby referred to in sentence 1, provided the elevator doors are designed to remain closed except while loading and unloading passengers, which is obviously typical for most elevators. So, next question is, can you please explain 9947? So 9947, stairways in two-story group D or E buildings. I believe I already went over this, but it's typically applicable to, if you have a two-story building or suite, that is either group D offices or group E mercantile. If you meet any of these provisions under 9947, which is that, first of all, the building is 2 stories, and the area occupied by the suite is not greater than 100 meters square per story. So you can have only 100 meters square per story in the 2-story building. And the travel distance from any point in the suite. So for instance, if you're on the 2nd story, you measure the travel distance from the remotest point on the 2nd story down the open stair to the exterior exit doorway. Then you can have open stairs serving the group D or E building that conforms to these requirements in the code. Next question is, can you please explain what is the difference between the requirements for 9, 10, 12, that is 1.2 meter distance between openings, and the requirement that asks for 3 meter distance? So the 1.2 meter distance is actually the distance between the openings. So this distance is measured along the exterior wall. The 3 meter distance is the distance that to prevent exposure protection. So if you have your openings, window openings, and they are located on the exterior wall such that they are more than 3 meters apart, then the whole idea is that there is no exposure protection issue. So then you do not have to either protect either of the windows in the exterior walls. But the 1.2 meter distance is if the distance between the window openings is 1.2 meters, you have to rate the portion of the exterior wall between the window openings. In an interpretive center, do the exhibits attached to a wall or ceiling have to comply to the flame spread ratings? So that's a tricky question. Hold on a second, please. So to answer the question regarding the for instance, if you have exhibits um, in an interpretive center, so it depends on the extent to which these exhibits are laid on the, for instance, on the wall. So if it is such that it covers a significant portion of the area of the wall, then it may come into question. Other than that, the requirements in the code for interior finishes are applicable to surfaces that form part of the interior surface of the wall or the ceiling. So if it is the area is such that it questions the exhibit that you have on the surface of the wall, then you may be required to comply with the flame spread rating requirements for that. I believe this answers your question, but if it doesn't, you can send me an email and I will try and then follow up on this question. Question, so we have a few more questions to answer, just about 4 more. Question 40. Third floor egress, 1 meter. How do we solve this? I believe I answered this. So there are some waivers. So if the sill of the window is more than 450 millimeters, you do not have to provide a guard. And on top of that, also window can be used an exit from basement, correct? Yeah, so windows can be used as an exit from a basement, from bedrooms in a basement, and that is actually addressed in the code, and that is where we talked about the requirements for clearance in the window wall. So, and the clearance has to be not less than 760 millimeters. Question 42, 91013. So 91013. Still under items under part 3. So question is, I don't get how we have an A occupancy in the building and the building is still considered as part 9. I thought that having an A in the building, then the whole building has to be in part 3, not part 9. So if the A is a minor occupancy, it's not a major occupancy, and a major occupancy is where it's not a principal use of the building, or not more than 10, it doesn't occupy more than 10% of the floor area in the building, then the A occupancy can be classified as a minor occupancy, in which case the entire building can be designed to part 9. If it becomes a major occupancy, then you would have to go to part 3 of the building code. Next question is so the third floor egress and guard requirements still clash, I think, especially if you read 97152D. So let's look at what 97152D says, despite the exemption requirements in 99881. So 97, again, this is for egress from a dwelling unit. So what does 97152D say? There is no 97152D. Sorry, hold on a second. Yeah, so 98815 is, as I said earlier on, will waive the requirement for a guard if the window sill is more than 450 millimeters. You mentioned 97152D. I cannot find 97152D in the code. So, but if you want to further discuss this, you can shoot me an email and I will do my best to. We can chat about this offline. Next question is, does the SB12 requirements apply to NBC 2015? I'm not sure about that. Hold on a second. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . Yeah, so just to answer that, so SB12 is not in the NBC, it's in the OBC, and I believe whatever energy efficiency requirements that are in the NBC may be applicable to to the building. Then again, this is an energy matter. So question 45: in residential occupancy, multiple units, can a third floor window be an exit? So it's not necessarily an exit. It's just a means of escape. So it's just a means of escape for a multi-story dwelling unit. So it's still one dwelling unit, but it is multi-story, right? Yeah. Hopefully this answers the question. And the last question is, but the diagram shows the openings are unprotected. Regarding 9, 10, 12, actually they are unprotected and 1.2 meters apart. That's okay. So let's look at the diagram for 9, 10, 12. So 9, 10, 12. And that will be the last question for the day. So 9, 10, 12. So 9, 10, 12, 3, that is the subsection in the code, exterior walls meeting at an angle. Okay. So except as provided in Article 9945. So 9945 will take you back to the openings in the exterior walls of exits. So in this case, these are not exits. Okay, so where exterior walls of a building meet at an external angle of 135 degrees or less, the horizontal distance from an unprotected opening in one exterior wall to an unprotected opening in the other exterior wall shall not be less than 1.2 meters, where these openings are in different fire compartments or in dwelling units. So again, so the first thing is that the horizontal distance measured from the edge of the openings is not less than 1.2 meters, and the area of the opening where it is 1.2 meters, the area of the exterior wall within the 1.2 meters needs to have the same fire resistance rating as required for the interior separation. So just to chip in, typically you would not be required to rate this exterior wall if the building is sprinkler protected. I believe this is not explicitly mentioned in the code, but there is a similar requirement in Part 3 of the code for exterior wall exposed to an exterior. So because Part 9 buildings are typically sprinkler protected, that's why the portion of the exterior wall within the 1.2 meters from the window has to be protected, and this is to limit or prevent any exposure issues from one fire compartment to the other through the exterior walls. I believe this answers your question, and we will then bring our presentation to an end. Again, if you have any questions, just feel free to send me an email. My email is at the end of the slide, and I will do my best to answer them all. Thank you. Enjoy your evening and the rest of the weekend.